This is the story of a truly remarkable woman. During the most turbulent period of Irish and European history, she changed the world around her. And she did it calmly, courageously, and in a way never seen before. Who was this woman? Mary Frances Aikenhead. And she's been called other things: mold breaker, feminist, visionary, servant of the poor. She was all that and more. This is her story. Mary was born here in Daunt Square in Cork in January 1787. She was the eldest of 4 children from a mixed marriage. Her father, a Protestant of Scottish descent, her mother a Catholic. Mary herself was baptised into the Anglican communion. Her father, David Aikenhead, was a doctor and a chemist, and his pharmacy was over here. Her mother, Mary Stackpole, was from a well-known merchant family in Cork. And down here on her doorstep lay the Grand Parade. At the time, one of the most fashionable boulevards in the city. Here the well-to-do and well-heeled would take their evening strolls, crisscrossing the tiny bridges and canals in all their finery, the Aikenhead family among them. It's fair to say that Mary Aikenhead's early life was a world of wealth, privilege, high social class and standing. But she was soon to learn that there was another world entirely in Cork, a world where the poor and the destitute lived miserable lives in dreadful poverty. They would have a profound effect on Mary and her future direction in life. Sister Miriam Tuig is a religious sister of charity from Cork. She knows a great deal about Mary Aikenhead, especially about her early life.
Cork was a very different place from what it is today. It is very hard for us to visualise how poor some of the people in Cork were. Mary Aikenhead was born in 1787. The penal laws were still in force but had become rather relaxed. As a matter of fact, when her parents married in 1785, the father being a Protestant and the mother a Catholic, it was a courageous step for the father to take. Because of the penal laws, he have lost his business and his position in life, but he didn't.
So what was Cork like in Mary Aikenhead's time? Michael Lenihan is a local historian. So Michael, tell me about Cork in the 18th century.
Well, Cork was a very, very different place from what we know today, obviously. People were living in a warren of lanes. There were some very horrific conditions then as well, because there was no water supply in the city at the time. And the majority of people had to get water from the river. Many of them lived in just one little room. The whole problem with the poor is they were kind of caught in a poverty trap. So as soon as a boy or a girl reached a certain age, they were sent out to work. So the only way to get out of this poverty trap was education. The merchants kind of comprised of about maybe 15% of the population, and I mean these are kind of people that had money. They weren't extraordinarily wealthy, but they could certainly put food on the table, and they had heat and they had shelter. And the mayor at the time, he was the head really of the corporation, the Cork Corporation. He was elected solely by Protestant ballot.
There was one more thing that would have an equally profound effect on Mary's life. It was as a result of Cork's location. The Gaelic name for Cork is Corkig, which means marsh. So while its low-lying position meant it was ideal as a port, it was far from ideal from a health point of view. Fog and damp were major sources of infection, mainly serious chest infections. Like many, Mary began life quite frail and soon developed what we'd know today as a serious asthmatic condition. Medical wisdom at that time suggested sufferers be moved to higher ground, where the air would be less dense. Mary's family decided to have her unofficially fostered with a nanny here in the north side of the city, in Eason's Hill, in the shadow of St Anne's Church, Shandon. This would sow the first seed of a later vocation. Her nanny, Mary Rourke, and her husband John already had children of their own, but one extra baby in their small cottage didn't appear to be a major issue. For the first 6 years of her life, Mammy Rourke and Daddy John, as Mary affectionately called them, became her second parents. They got a weekly allowance from the Aikenhead family, and they raised Mary like one of their own. They were devout Catholics who said the rosary every night. As for Mass on Sundays, well, that turned out to be an education in itself for a young girl in her formative years. At that time, Catholic church buildings couldn't face onto main streets. So in a side street near Shandon was the North Chapel, or what Catholics called the Bishop's Chapel. When Catholics were coming here for Mass on Sunday, the Protestants were going to morning service at the nearby and more visible Shandon Church. The story goes that one Sunday Dr. Aikenhead stopped his horse-drawn carriage and asked Mary, his daughter, to come with him to his church. She refused, saying she wanted to go to Mass with Mammy Rourke instead. Both faiths may have intermingled on the same streets, but each were very obviously going their separate ways to worship. For Mary, this was her first awakening that her native city was two different worlds. The poorer people who lived here on the hill, the richer half who lived down there in the city. When Mary was 6, she returned to her parents in Daunt Square in much better health. By then she had 2 sisters, Anne and Margaret, and a brother St. John would soon be on the way. Mammy Rourke and Daddy John also joined them in the nursery and as Dr. Aikenhead's personal coach driver. Mary attended an exclusive school, getting trained to take her place in genteel society. She even started going to church service on Sunday with her father in his horse-drawn carriage. However, within a few short years, this idyllic family situation and Mary's life would be turned upside down. In France and across much of Europe, the revolutionary wars were raging. In Ireland, partly in response to the plight of Catholics, the United Irishmen instigated their own rebellion in 1798. For the Aikenheads, this was a dangerous time. The fallout of the rebellion took its toll on Mary's father. His standing as a respected doctor in the community had probably saved him and his family from serious harm. Nonetheless, he decided to sell his medical practice so that his family would be provided for. He wanted his daughters to have substantial dowries. His young son St. John, who was seriously ill, would have the best medical treatment money could buy. The family moved from Daunt Square to a much larger house. In 1799, when Mary was only 12 years old, they moved a short distance across the south channel of the River Lee to Rutland Street. South Chapel and Presentation Convent were within walking distance, and both were strongly connected to Mary's family. Providentially, no doubt, these would exert considerable influence on Mary Aikenhead and her future life, as would the return of a close relative. The move to Rutland Street coincided with her Aunt Rebecca's return to Cork after many years abroad. She was widowed and had been living a religious life in a little cottage attached to a convent in Bruges. She and Mary would have long talks on religion and read and discuss many books. Rebecca would even help sneak her out to Mass in nearby South Chapel, which her relatives, the Stackpoles, had helped rebuild. It was here at Mass one morning that she heard a sermon by Dr. Florence McCarthy, Coadjutor Bishop of Cork. It was about Lazarus and Dives, the story of the wealthy, uncaring man who went to hell and the crumb-begging beggar who ended up in paradise. That was the moment her life changed forever. The more she learned and saw of the conditions of the poor in the city, the more she struggled with her conscience and her privileged social position. Years later she would write, "How my heart trembles at the awful state of our poor people, and in a sense, more dreadfully do I feel about the miserable rich ones." Deep down, she knew the choice. Help the poor and live a fulfilled life, or turn a blind eye and live a wretched one. In December 1801, when she was just 14, her beloved father took seriously ill. He didn't last the year. After decades of wrestling with his moral and religious conscience, Dr. Aikenhead converted to the Catholic faith on his deathbed. That was a defining moment for Mary, and she too converted shortly afterwards. Within 6 months, she received her first communion and confirmation. She took Frances as her confirmation name, possibly in honour of Francis Moylan, the Bishop of Cork. Her sisters and brothers were also received into the faith. From now on, Mary's life would be devoted to the poor, or God's nobility, as she called them. Her path may have been well defined. Her steps ahead were far from clear. It soon became apparent that her desire to help the poor where she felt they most needed it, in their homes, was near impossible for a member of a religious order. At that time, Irish orders were enclosed, all their good works confined behind the convent walls. This was not the life Mary envisaged for herself. She wanted the hands-on approach of distributing food and clothing, visiting the sick or comforting the dying. In towns and cities, people were living in appalling slum conditions, poverty, hunger and disease rampant. Despite their desperate cries for help, it seems Ireland wasn't ready for an order of nuns to work outside the convent. Things were further complicated by her mother's poor health. She was practically an invalid. Being the eldest, Mary had to take on the role of businesswoman, looking after the finances, maintaining a property portfolio and making business decisions. She was also expected to engage in the social rituals of the wealthy in a world of ball gowns, soirees and potential suitors. After all, a girl of her age and status would soon be expected to marry and settle down. Mary Aikenhead was barely 18 years of age, yet her obvious piety and calling were being tested and pulled at from all sides. In later life, Mary would have complete trust in divine providence. An intervention from that source was sorely needed now. It happened during a conversation with Bishop Moylan about the French Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. He informed her that this order had managed to get around the rules of enclosure and were free to visit the poor outside. They had no foundation in Ireland, and that was of added interest to Mary. An even more telling encounter was just around the corner. In November 1807, she met Anna Maria O'Brien, who was in Cork for the profession of her sister Cecilia. Anna Maria was from an affluent Dublin merchant family with a strong social conscience and well known for helping the poor of the capital city. They were close friends with Father Daniel Murray, who would later become Archbishop of Dublin. Indeed, another of Anna Maria's sisters, Frances, would go on to found the Loreto order. In Anna Maria, Mary found a kindred spirit, and she gladly accepted her invitation to visit Dublin in the near future. However, it was 2 years before they got to meet again. Mary's mother died after a long illness. No matter that her heart was broken, Mary was now head of the family and legal guardian of 2 younger sisters and a seriously ill little brother. She was just 22 years old. After 2 years, her family situation became a bit more settled, and Mary was able to visit Anna Maria, who lived in the Georgian splendour of Mountjoy Square. It was here that she renewed contact with Father Daniel Murray, or Dr. Murray as he now was. He sounded her out about joining an order of nuns who could visit the poor in their homes. She told him that if an efficient superior could be found to head it up, he could count on her to join such an order. Little did she realise that Dr. Murray had an even bigger plan in mind for her. He believed she was not being called to join an existing order, but rather to found one of her own, a new congregation of sisters who would work outside the convent walls, in the homes of the poor and the sick. This was what she'd always wanted, waited impatiently and prayed vehemently for. But when the reality dawned on her that she might actually be able to make this happen, panic set in. Her mind was in turmoil. She felt completely out of her depth, and she had some tough questions to face. Was she abandoning her family? Who'd believe that someone so inexperienced could be the congregation's superior? What would the congregation be named? What rule of life would they follow? Even more pressing, where would she find a similar order that she could learn from? Studying at the Daughters of Charity Novitiate in France was out of the question. The Napoleonic Wars were at their peak. Travelling was far too dangerous. Once again, divine providence intervened. The answer lay a short distance across the Irish Sea, the Bar Convent in York, England. It was steeped in history and Catholic tradition. It was not bound by enclosure. Its rule was based on the Jesuit model of contemplatives in action. It was perfect. So on June 6, 1812, exactly 10 years to the day since she was first received into the church, Mary Aikenhead entered the Bar Convent in Micklegate, York, to prepare for the rest of her life. Here in Dublin, at the Mary Aikenhead Heritage Centre in Harold's Cross, I met with the current Superior General of the Religious Sisters of Charity, Sister Mary Christian. She shared her thoughts on the difficult and life-changing decisions that faced the young Mary Aikenhead. And we took a tour of the centre, which hosts hundreds of artefacts, letters and audio visuals, all illuminating her extraordinary life. So Mary Aikenhead was an amazing woman by any standards. What was her motivation?
Mary Aikenhead was a very brave woman. She knew that God was calling her to be a religious. Living in Cork, she was very familiar with the Ursuline and the Presentation convents, both of which were enclosed at that time. They didn't go out. And now she felt that God was calling her to do something different. And Archbishop Murray was assuring her that that was the case and that he had her almost in line to be the foundress of this new congregation. But Mary was hesitant. She said to Dr. Murray that she would need some kind of training, she would need some time away. And he arranged for her to go to the Institute of the Blessed Virgin Mary in York, known as the Bar Convent because of its proximity to Micklegate Bar. While she was there, she had an opportunity to study the rules of different congregations, and also at this time she thought a bit about the Daughters of Charity, and she was impressed by their mission. But the fact that they did not make final vows or perpetual vows didn't really sit easy with her. So she thought they had to renew their vows every year. So she thought that this wasn't what God was asking her to do. While she was in the Bar Convent in York, she had an opportunity to study the Ignatian spirituality and also to make a retreat guided by those principles. And somehow she knew that this is what God was asking her for her new congregation, to follow the spirituality of St. Ignatius of Loyola.
Tell me about the fourth vow as well. Was that something extra that they took as well?
Mary knew that her congregation was a little different from most congregations up to that point. She wanted to serve the poor in their homes, on the streets, wherever which was necessary. And she was looking at the vows that other congregations take: poverty, chastity, obedience. And she saw these three vows as necessary for her congregation. But in addition to that, she wished her congregation to have a fourth vow, that of service of the poor.
For Mary Aikenhead, her battles were only just beginning. Battles against her own ill health, against outbreaks of cholera and the Great Famine, against diocesan intransigence, and challenges from within the order. She's been 3 years in a convent in York and she's still only 28. And she's coming back to Dublin to found a congregation. The dream is about to become a reality. She and her fledgling Sisters of Charity opened their first convent in North William Street, Dublin that year, the first link in a chain that would not be broken. The convent came with the care of 10 orphans, and this was Mary's first challenge on the long journey of growing a congregation dedicated to serving the poor. Her spiritual director was the formidable Jesuit Father Peter Kenny. And in 1816, with the aid of Dr. Murray in Rome, the congregation received papal recognition of her work, along with approval for the addition of a fourth vow of service of the poor. 3 years later, She opened Stanhope Street Convent despite the tragic death of some of her earliest young recruits from consumption and fever. The congregation had recently adopted the motto, Caritas Christi urget nos. The love of Christ urges us on. Their faith in it was now being severely tested. In 1821, the governor of Kilmainham Jail invited the Sisters of Charity to visit 2 female prisoners who'd been sentenced to death. Mary personally attended to both prisoners prior to their very public execution. Prison visitations continued from that period onwards, and 17 years later, Mary was asked to send volunteers to extend this mission to Sydney and Parramatta to look after the growing numbers and needs of women who were in prison in Australia. At a time of great turbulence within the congregation here in Ireland, Mary managed to prepare 5 nuns and get them ready for this challenging mission. The journey by boat took over 4 months to complete and set new horizons for the congregation. These sisters are credited as being the first religious women to land on Australian soil. This was a new and important apostolic venture. The poorest of the poor, beloved of Mary Aikenhead, often ended up in jail. To this day, the Sisters of Charity carry on the work of prison visitation with the very same determination, understanding and love. Despite her own deteriorating health, she established new convents and schools around Dublin, one in Peacock Lane in Cork, and others in Waterford, Clarenbridge and Clonmel. Some were established during the worst episodes in Irish social history, the cholera epidemic of 1832 and the Great Famine of the mid-1840s. It was clear to Mary Aikenhead that the sisters needed to look after the health of the poor, so the original St Vincent's Hospital was opened on Stephen's Green, Dublin in 1834, with no equipment and few qualified staff. But Mary Aikenhead put her drive and determination to good use, with the support of Anna Maria O'Brien and Dr. Joseph O'Farrell. In time, St Vincent's became one of the finest run hospitals in Europe and the first in the English-speaking world to be run by a religious congregation. In 1830, Mary moved her sisters from North William Street to a newly built convent in Upper Gardiner Street. This was done with a donation of £4,000 from a generous benefactor. The congregation was set to flourish. Not even a challenge to the special 4th vow of service to the poor, or the dismissal in 1837 of Eliza Bodenham, Sister Ignatius the novice mistress who challenged her leadership, could prevent the congregation from spreading far and wide. Though she had spent the final 30 years of her life bedbound by crippling spinal problems and hardly able to sit up, she wrote thousands of letters, organising convents, raising funds, and acting as a spiritual guide to thousands of religious at home and abroad. Sister Mary Christian summed up the legacy that Mary Aikenhead left to the congregation of the Religious Sisters of Charity and to the poor of Ireland and beyond. She ended up nonetheless for 30 years bedridden.
That's right.
And suffering terribly, it would appear. And yet she wrote a lot. And through her writings, what sense do we get of the woman?
First of all, she left us our charism. And as well as that, she wanted to show us how we could live out that charism. And by doing that, she wrote many letters. We're very fortunate that we have access to many of these letters today. And we can read them, we can go back over them and see. We can be inspired by them. We can see how at her time she was always looking for new ways of helping people. And nothing daunted her. She was always ready for a challenge. Some of her letters are very rich in directions, teaching us how she might have acted in a particular situation. Some of these have been extracted into books and shorter forms, and we call these her sayings. It is her sayings that inspire us from day to day.
And what kind of sayings speak to you as you go about your daily work?
One of them is, what we do, we ought to do well. Another that I find very helpful is when she says, pray, reflect, and consult, and may the Divine Spirit direct all to the greater glory of God. Mary also had her own personal motto, I can do all things in Him who strengthens me. I suppose Mary Aikenhead's real legacy to us is her desire that we continue to serve the poor as she would have done. She had such a tremendous desire to serve people who were poor or marginalised in whatever way. There was no limits. She could see possibilities everywhere. And I think, as we look back on her, that's part of what she has left to us. That's part of our heritage. And we probably don't always live up to that. And recent times have shown that her expectations for us were sadly not met. We're celebrating the 200th anniversary, and that's a great opportunity for us to focus on where we are today. What would Mary Aikenhead want us to do today? We have our charism, this rich charism that was left to us and to our church. And constantly we see all the different problems that are around us, different needs today, and we just have to keep asking, how would Mary Aikenhead serve the poor if she were here today? That's the constant question we have on our lips, because she is our foundress. She's the person that was responsible for all the work that has gone on over the last 200 years.
From Our Lady's Hospice in Harold's Cross to St Vincent's Hospital in Sydney, Australia, her words of wisdom and spiritual insight have carried around the world, to England and Scotland, the United States, Central America, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, Indonesia, Vietnam, Malawi, Zambia and Nigeria. Schools, hospitals and orphanages still bear her hallmarks. In 1858, after a life of service and devotion to God, Mary Aikenhead passed away. Her last recorded words were even dedicated to God's nobility, the poor. Mary Aikenhead's funeral cortege left from Harold's Cross and arrived an hour and a half later to the small Donnybrook Chapel, adjacent to the former grounds of Donnybrook Castle, now in the ownership of the congregation. The following day, her Requiem Mass was celebrated by bishops and clergy from many dioceses throughout Ireland. Then, with her own sisters and the ordinary people who loved her, she was brought to this small cemetery. In an expression of their love and affection for her, a group of Dublin workmen asked to carry her coffin the short distance from the old chapel here in Donnybrook to the grave here, where she was finally laid to rest. On her deathbed, she predicted that the congregation would flourish when I am gone. She was right. Mold breaker, feminist, visionary, servant of the poor, and prophet. A truly remarkable woman.
Thank you.